All right, high rollers. Last time we had this guy on the show, he warned me I may never watch sports the same way ever again. And you know what? He was right. A penalty call late in the third period of a hockey game, one of those 50-yard pass interference calls in the NFL. And how about that basketball team that was supposed to cover easy but somehow didn't? Is it all just part of the game, or is there something more nefarious going on? Brian Tuohy, the world's number one sports skeptic, the leading authority on sports conspiracies, and author of The Fixes In, Larceny Games, A Season in the Abyss, and Disaster Government. Brian, welcome back to the show, man. Thanks for being our high roller today.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me, Derek.
Season in the Abyss, sports gambling versus the NFL's integrity. We haven't spoken since its release. On your website, thefixisin.net, it states, the NFL says it doesn't condone gambling, but such talk is meaningless when gambling is legal and vigorous in Nevada. Tuohy admits that there's no record of the biggest, most shadowy operators, but the records of police departments, the FBI, and investigative reporters offer clear evidence of an army of bookies ready to serve as bettors and organize crime. Quote, bookies are the foot soldiers of this illegal empire, unquote. The NFL, Brian, prime example of sports conspiracy, or what? What's going on there?
Well, I look at game fixing a lot, and I look at it from two different angles. One being games being fixed by the leagues themselves, basically for entertainment purposes and to develop storylines and to make things more interesting. Kind of was like professional wrestling, but I don't claim that every game is fixed. I believe it's something that the NFL kind of nudges when it needs to, a lot of times through its officiating. And on the other end, I look at game fixing from a gambling aspect, where players or referees have been bribed or blackmailed into shaving points or outright fixing games. And believe it or not, there actually is a history of that. It's just uncovering that history is a very difficult job, but it is out there, and it's in FBI files that I've uncovered, and it's available, around if you really dig into it.
So the question of, are all sports fixed? Your answer there is no, but perhaps they can be if the league wanted it to be.
Well, and it's perfectly legal for the NFL to fix its own game, believe it or not. There's no law that prevents it. That's the scary part. The only laws that come close is there's a law that dates back to the quiz show scandal in the 1950s when the networks were fixing their game shows in exactly the same way the NFL would be like fixing its own game, is to make it more entertaining. And if you've ever seen the movie, there's a movie called Quiz Show that was directed by Robert Redford that details exactly how this happened, but they did it for years until they were finally busted by a congressional investigation. But the law passed out of that investigation only specifically mentioned intellectual contests such as game shows. It did not go to sports. So that law doesn't cover it. And the other law that exists is one called the Sports Bribery Act from 1964, but that only covers bribing a player, a referee, or a coach to alter the outcome of a game. If the league, like the NBA, told its referees how to do its job, and the way it kind of implied on how to do their job allowed one team an advantage over another team, well, that's not fixing. That's just an employer telling an employee how to do their job, and it doesn't fall under that law either. So really, there's no law that prevents this from occurring. And I think when you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar business where, obviously a lot of money's at stake, what prevents them enacting such, subterfuge against fans?
Yeah, it's such big business, right? The TV contracts, the NFL wants ratings, and on the other side, the organized crime side, they can get to players to fix a game to sweeten the outcome of their bet, their wager.
Well, exactly, and a lot of people say, well, first of all, the NFL says it's never happened. They said they've never had a game fixed in their history, which most people laugh at. But that's their stance because no one's ever been convicted of that crime. And yet, if you look around the world, you look at soccer, you look at tennis, rugby, cricket. There are game fixing incidents ongoing right now in every one of those sports in multiple countries around the world. Yet, in the United States, we seem to think it's impossible and it never happens because no one gets convicted of it. But the fact is it doesn't matter if, some of these athletes are making millions of dollars, or even hundreds of millions of dollars, because some of those guys who have made that kind of money, guys like Allen Iverson in the NBA, Mantuan Walker in the NBA, even guys in the NFL like Warren Sapp, they've gone bankrupt as soon as they've left the game. So even though they make a lot of money, as Patrick Ewing famously said, they also spend a lot of money, or they sometimes get bilked out of a lot of money. And so sometimes, even veteran players, despite the fact that they look like they're millionaires, may actually be struggling to get by, and so may be open to doing something like throwing a game or shaving points if everything, shakes out right. So, I mean, you can get to these athletes, even college athletes especially, but, you can get to professional athletes, I think, and corrupt them. It's just kind of more of a crime of opportunity than one where somebody sits back and says, well, I'm going to fix this weekend's Bears-Packers game because I feel I can do it. It's more they need that in order to get into a player and get him, or a referee, and get him to affect the outcome of a game.
You talk about getting in with a player. There are many ways, right? When you think about it, and this is something most sports fans don't think about, but these players are ultimately vulnerable, aren't they?
Oh, I believe so. I mean, we've seen enough criminal athletes, right? I mean, they're everywhere. Every week there's a different athlete getting arrested for this, that, or the other thing. But I mean, even in, you think about something like performance-enhancing drugs, and a lot of fans see that as almost kind of a benign crime, I think. I think a lot of fans don't even care. If these guys take steroids, what do I care as long as they provide entertainment for me and hitting long home runs, or, being able to play at a level that's almost superhuman. But they've found in Europe, where they've investigated a lot of these game-fixing things in soccer, that the people who are supplying performance-enhancing drugs to the athletes will then basically blackmail those athletes and get them to fix games because of what they provided. So even something, that's kind of seen as not much of a crime here in the United States by players, using performance-enhancing drugs, can actually lead to other sorts of corruption within the sport.
Last time you were on, you asked two questions that have really stuck with me, and this is going back 4 years now. You asked, why did the Saints win the Super Bowl after Hurricane Katrina? And why did the Patriots win the Super Bowl after 9/11? Coincidence? And those questions have stuck with me, man. I wonder about that. Is it a coincidence, or is there something more going on?
Well, that's the thing, is I don't believe in coincidence when hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake. How many times can the ball bounce the league's way? I mean, you had Boston Strong just a couple years ago after the Boston Marathon bombing, where the Red Sox were predicted to do nothing, won the World Series that year. I mean, again, is that just a lucky coincidence for the city of Boston, or was that, maybe somebody pulling a few strings to take advantage of a situation and build a storyline out of it? And even though it's a tragic situation they've built out of, again, how many times can you see that happen? How many times can you see something lead to something else and think, well, that was just coincidence, as opposed to thinking, well, maybe there's something going on here, because they do have the ability to do these things. They do have the ability, like I said, to legally fix games. And if they want to do that, no one's really stopping them, especially when the sports media isn't really just compliant. They literally fund professional sports. I mean, think about the NFL. I mean, the NFL makes $6 billion a year from its media, from Fox, from NBC, from ESPN. They fund professional sports. And then are those same networks, are those same entities really going to do investigative reporting and root out all the corruption within those leagues that they just basically invested in? I don't think so. And I think it's provable by just going to ESPN's website and seeing how much investigative reporting really goes on and how much criminal activity they uncover, how much drug activity they uncover. They don't uncover any of that stuff. Professional law enforcement does. And then, the reporters jump on what the law enforcement has found, because then the cat's already out of the bag.
We're going to talk about ESPN more in a second, but you bring up Boston Strong. There's another example that I didn't even think about. It really is amazing, and it makes you wonder. I was going to prep a lot of questions for this interview, but then I checked out your Twitter page, and I thought, why don't I just run down a few of the tweets and retweets that you've got on your Twitter page, and we can cover a wide range of topics. First off, the Kentucky Derby was last Saturday. You tweeted, quote, "No matter what stories NBC hypes, horse racing is historically the most corrupt sport. If you love horses, you won't support Kentucky Derby."
Yeah, I did, and I believe that. And it really comes out of the fact that when I wrote this book, Larceny Games, I uncovered over 400 FBI investigative files that I got through the Freedom of Information Act that were directly related to this sports bribery law that was passed in 1964. And basically it was all the FBI's investigations into fixed games or fixed boxing matches or fixed horse races. And amazingly, I mean, there was a ton of investigations into fixed horse races. And what was shocking to me was that they weren't just fixed races to get a winner. They would fix races to get a trifecta or a superfecta. So they were fixing the top 3 or top 4 horses and the order of finish in these horse races. In fact, one FBI agent I spoke to said, who had done investigations into fixed horse races, said sometimes races were so corrupt, nobody wanted to win the race because one group of jockeys were holding their horses back and the other group were holding their horses back. So it's like nobody wanted to, reach the finish line. These things were so corrupt. But what they do to the horses, unfortunately, is in the FBI files, they talk about how they electrocute the horses, how they stuff sponges up the horses' noses so they can't breathe as well. They drug them. I mean, they do all sorts of horrible things to these animals because they can't talk. And yet, this is what they do to fix these races to, get the results they want to make a few extra bucks.
Yeah, I recently had a blackjack card counter on, and he said that these card counters are so smart at doing what they do, they inevitably move on to other things. And he told me that horse racing is one of the most wagered on sports going, and there's a lot of corruption.
Well, it's, I think, the number one wagered upon sporting event in the world is horse racing. I mean, if you want to get into sports, people sports, it's soccer, but I think overall it actually is horse racing. And after soccer, actually, amazingly enough, is tennis, which I found kind of bizarre, but that's how widespread tennis betting is, and that's why I think you've seen a lot of investigations and corruption within tennis, is because, the more money involved, it seems like the more corruption is involved. I mean, even poker, you deal with poker, and I mean, there have been accusations, obviously, of people cheating at poker in various ways, right? I mean, it's, you like to think that it's a mano-a-mano sport, poker, but then there's, table talk, there's collusion, and online poker is, I know it was at least, incredibly corrupt with all the different ways that they could fix and alter matches in the online poker world.
Some people could even see the other player's hole cards.
Yeah, exactly. That makes it pretty easy, doesn't it? I mean, you have a program that'll show you what everybody's got. I mean, heck, I could be good at it.
Well, you talk about, not just going for win, place, or show, but they're going for all three with the trifectas and the super trifectas. Greed is at the heart of it. You also mentioned soccer, and a player was recently suspended for 18 months for betting on games, including a few of his own. You tweeted, quote, "Yeah, I have a gambling problem. Yeah, I bet on games I played in, but this suspension is ridiculous."
Oh, it is. Because, I mean, again, people don't I know soccer is growing in popularity, but not a lot of people love it. But if you go back to the 1960s, in the NFL, you had two players, Alex Karras for the Lions, and you had Paul Hornung for the Packers, who got suspended from the league for betting on their own games. And, of course, the quote back then was the same thing as this guy's quote is, "Yeah, I was betting on my own games, but I wasn't fixing the games. I was betting on my team to win." Although, in the case of the soccer guy, he was actually betting on his own team to lose, too. but with Hornung and Karras, the thing was, okay, well, he's betting on his own games. Same with even Pete Rose. He was betting on his own games, but betting on the Reds to win. Well, who's to say, what else comes out of that then? Because if, Hornung bet on the Packers to win, or Rose bet on the Reds to win, then he may go all out for that one game to ensure his bet wins because he, obviously wants to make the money. But in the next week, when he doesn't bet on his own team, then is it because he blew himself out the week before, so he won't play as well this week? It's a sign to his bookie that he was betting through that he doesn't think his team's going to do well that week. I mean, it ends up being a chain of events. And it almost in a way still winds up being fixing because, again, especially with Rose betting on the Reds, if he bet on the Reds in the first two games of the series he managed and he really worked his bullpen to win those two games because he had bet on them, then in game three he basically knew his team was spent, and in a way he really fixed that third game to ensure almost that the Reds won't win. So, I mean, even though a guy's maybe betting on his own team, there's a lot of things that surround this that really affect the sport, the integrity, and even the betting community with these games.
You retweeted something I found very interesting, dating back to 1992, perhaps the crux of the entire problem. Senator Bradley's Roulette Chips quote, "State-sanctioned sports betting puts the imprimatur of the state on this activity. It conveys the message that sports are more about money than personal achievement and sportsmanship. In these days of scandal and disillusionment, it is important that our youngsters not receive this message. Athletes are not roulette chips, but sports gambling treats them as such. If the dangers of state-sponsored sports betting are not confronted, the character of sports and youngsters' views of them could be seriously threatened."
And Bradley, obviously, he was a former basketball player, and so he does have, it has a little weight to what he says, I'm sure, but at the same time, sports gambling is everywhere, whether we want to admit it or not, and unfortunately, 98% or maybe 95%, it's an argument, but whatever, a large, vast majority is done illegally, it's done through bookies, and those bookies for the most part, are connected to organized crime, and sports gambling is really one of the top two money makers for the mafia in the United States to this day. So on one hand, I could see, okay, you want to keep it illegal, but at the same time, if you do legalize it and you legalize it nationally, well, then there's some oversight. Then all these things come out from underneath the shadows, and you can examine it. There's oversight, there's taxes, there's licensing, there's all sorts of things that go along with it. So to me, you almost have to legalize it, because otherwise you're just going to leave it in organized crime's control, and then nobody knows what's going on. And there's a lot of corruption that's going to be tied into that.
Well, speaking of Twitter, I recently posted Brian Tuohy was right again with regards to Billy Walters. You talked about it before 4 years ago. You said that he's got some kind of flow of information. It turns out he did. And it's real interesting how that flow of information works. You mentioned that the guy's betting against his own team. Well, the bookie knows, hey, he's not confident. Let's place a big bet, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly. And I mean, Walters, for years, he was obviously one of the best sports gamblers out there, highly respected. But people wondered where he got his information from and how he managed to be so successful. Well, with the stock deal, with the inside information that basically got him convicted, I think you have to convey that and say, well, what kind of inside information might he had on these sports events? Because I had heard rumors, but I heard rumors, that he was connected to several college basketball coaches and college football coaches. And so he did get inside information from these guys and used that to his advantage. How much? Hard to say. But the fact is, if it's proven now that he did this in the stock market, what's to say he wasn't doing it in the sports gambling world?
Right. You'd have to think he was.
Yeah, it's kind of an obvious connection to make. And again, I don't want to necessarily accuse him wrongly, but I think it raises a lot of questions.
Okay, a few more questions. We're running short on time. ESPN, a bunch of layoffs, the on-air talent. You call it a propaganda machine. What's going on there?
That's a good question. ESPN's owned by Disney, and Disney's an entertainment, entity, and yet these are the people that are funding the NBA, that are funding the NFL, and I think it works in this whole cyclical arena of sports and potential investigations and potentially fixing games for entertainment purposes. I think with ESPN, though, they do have financial problems because they overpaid the NFL. They pay, literally, just in rights fees, they pay the NFL $110 million in rights fees for a single Monday night football game. That's insane. They don't make movies that expensive most of the time. They try to keep movie budgets under $50 million for some of these things. Yet they're paying $110 million a week to broadcast the NFL. So, they don't need all of these reporters. They don't need all of these writers, especially when most of what's being righted and reported on is either rehashed box scores or it's opinion pieces. And how many opinion pieces can fans take in? How many mock drafts can you read? Especially when they're all wrong. How much opinion do you need? So I think, the cost-cutting measures for them made sense, but in the grand scheme of things, that doesn't mean, ESPN's going out of business or they're going to stop funding the NFL, the NBA, Major League Baseball, and everybody else. It's just like I think they're, rearranging how they're doing things.
Infinitely corrupt sport of boxing. We recently saw Klitschko's KO by Anthony Joshua, and of course, Canelo Chavez, the Cinco de Mayo, much hyped, but really a lackluster performance. Where do you see boxing going in the future?
Well, I think they need some sort of spark if boxing's really going to survive. They need a Mike Tyson. They need a Muhammad Ali. They need somebody who brings excitement back to the sport, because I think UFC is really, and mixed martial arts have taken over for it. But the history of boxing is horribly corrupt, and it's provably horribly corrupt. It was run basically by organized crime in the 1950s and early 1960s, and when that dynasty fell apart, then you had a guy like Don King walk in and fill that void and make it equally as corrupt. It's a bad sport, but I think there's a lot of parallels between it and the UFC today. And I think, unfortunately, I would assume that if in boxing you've had a history of fighters tanking matches, fighters setting up really weak opponents to build up certain fighters' records to make them look, they're 29-0 with 26 KOs, but the fact is they haven't fought anybody yet, but it makes for a good hype for a heavyweight title fight or for a middleweight title fight. I'm sure the UFC is using those same tricks and those same corruptive influences within their sport to get the matchups they need, because it's working the same way the UFC is, the way the boxing did in the 50s with their weekly fights. That's the way the UFC has to survive, is by making events. And the only way you can make events, I think, is to manufacture them. And by manufacturing them, you're basically fixing fights along the way.
Are you saying boxing needs Conor McGregor?
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see if that fight actually takes place. It really will. But they need something like that, I think, yeah.
Okay, lastly, I know you're a political guy. The big news of this week, of course, FBI Director James Comey fired by Donald Trump. You have a lot of history with FBI files. Also, I wanted to ask you about the info warrior, Alex Jones, one of the biggest podcasters in the world. You were on his show. What's he like as a person? I mean, he seems like a pretty good guy, actually.
Well, it's funny. One time I was on I was scheduled to be on his show, and the interview was supposed to start at whatever at 9, and he came on to introduce me, and he got into a rant. And it was at the time when Lance Armstrong came out with, I did officially take performance enhancing drugs things. And he went on a rant about Lance Armstrong for 10 minutes before he ever introduced me on the show, and the producer actually cut in on my end and said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, but he does this sometimes." That's the way it goes, So, I mean, I've never really talked to Alex straight up besides being on the show, but, he's an interesting cat, that's for sure. Funny you bring up the Comey thing, too, because like you said, I've read hundreds of FBI files, and the only thing that kind of bothers me about it all is people seem to be freaking out the investigations have stopped now because Comey's fired. Well, in all the files I've read, all the investigative files, the director's never directly involved in any of those investigations. So I would assume and I would hope the FBI being a credible outlet and a credible law enforcement, community, that just because their director's gone doesn't mean all their investigations came to a screaming halt. I mean, I think it's more of a figurative and a figurehead position than anything.
Is there anything else I've missed before I let you go? Anything else you're following right now that you think's very interesting?
Well, I'm writing a new book, and I'm knee-deep in NCAA stuff. And I'm just amazed at how corrupt the NCAA is. And, I read a lot about people arguing that, athletes should get paid. And I can kind of see that argument because, obviously there's, again, hundreds of billions of dollars floating around out there. There's guys who are getting paid $500,000 to run a single bowl game. But I don't think you can pay the athletes. I don't think you can pay the athletes and call it an amateur sport. I think the only way, in my opinion, to fix the NCAA is to destroy it. And I think the only way to do that is you really have to eliminate college football and basketball and say, look, if the NBA and the NFL want to have their own minor league system, they go build it. But to have these things being run at state institutions and then say, well, we have to use tax money to not only pay coaches $3 to $4 to $5 to $6 million a year out of basically being the highest paid state employee, but now we have to pay the players as well. I don't see how you can do that with all the problems many state economies have.
You got to follow this guy. The Fix is in Tuohy on Twitter. Thefixisin.net is the website. NCAA, you got to quash it, he's saying. You got to check out the website again, thefixisin.net. I mentioned off the top, Brian, about the pass interference call, the 50-yarder late in the game in the NFL. Is that the most common thing, the way a league can fix a game, is some kind of call like that, or a late foul by an NBA referee?
I think that's the easiest way to do it, and I think it's one of those ways that they can do it blatantly and do it right in front of you, and fans don't, there's nothing fans can do. They have no recourse. And unfortunately, you can see, you're watching a game on your 60-inch HD TV, and you see a guy who's clearly in bounds, and yet they go to the review, and the referee trots back out in the field and says he was out of bounds. What are you going to do about it? And I mean, we've all seen it. I mean, we've seen phantom flags, we've seen bad calls, and it's always chalked up as human error. But the fact is, a lot of electronics, a lot of technology can actually eliminate human error, like in the strike zone in baseball, but they don't implement it. And I think you have to question why. And I think the answer is they want that human control still in the game so they can literally manipulate these games in front of your face.
It's really something, too. It's a whole industry, right? They've got the instant replay, the call, then they go to commercial, then they come back with the result.
Yeah, I mean, it's great television, and I've argued, too, if all they're doing when they do the instant replay is if they're talking back to New York about it, they probably should be just discussing the rules. So why can't we listen into that? Why can't we hear it as fans? Wouldn't that be interesting, to be able to hear what the referee and the guy back at the NFL headquarters are talking about the rules and why this is a catch or why this isn't a catch? But you can't. They don't release that information. You don't know. So I literally think sometimes when they're discussing these replays, they're actually saying, well, we can't give them this because it's going to make the game out of control, or we need to give them this because it's going to tighten the game up. And I really think they're talking about manipulating these games.
I'll tell you what, it really makes you wonder. The books are interesting, folks. The Fix is in, Larceny Games, A Season in the Abyss, and Disaster Government. The author is Brian Tuohy, at The Fix is in Tuohy on Twitter, and thefixisin.net is the website. Brian, thank you so much, man. It's fascinating.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me, Derek. I appreciate it.